Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take sources you send us, dig into them, and pull out the most fascinating bits. Basically, it's your shortcut to getting up to speed without getting totally overwhelmed.
And today, we're looking at a really challenging time
Mm.
for humans.
Yeah.
The last glacial period in Europe. How did people cope with extreme cold?
Exactly. We're focusing on this one archaeological site that's giving us some amazing clues. It's called Kammern-Grubgraben.
Right, in Austria.
Yeah. So for this deep dive, we've got a couple of sources. First, a general article, Ancient Camp Shows How Humans Adapted to Extreme Cold in Europe. Gives a good overview.
And second, we have the actual research paper. It's from the Journal of Paleolithic Archaeology called Ice Age Apparel-Changing Cray Patterns Towards the Last Glacial Maximum and the Role of Reindeer Fur for Clothing at Kammern-Grubgraben. Bit of the mouthful.
Yeah, just a bit. But our mission here is basically to figure out the survival tricks. What were these Ice Age Europeans doing? Especially looking for those, surprising adaptations that this Austrian site reveals.
Okay, let's get into it. Kammern-Grubgraben. It's in Lower Austria.
Right.
And what's really striking, first off, is when people were heavily using this site. We're talking roughly 24,000 to 20,000 years ago.
Which is smack bang in the last glacial maximum.
Precisely. The LGM. Probably the coldest part of the last ice age. And to give you an idea of the conditions, the estimated mean annual temperature, minus 3.5 degrees Celsius.
Whoa, okay, wait. Minus 3.5 C average for the year?
Yeah, not just winter. That's the average.
That's brutal. And the sources said there's evidence people were actually living there during the winter months.
Which seems counterintuitive, right? Why be there during the absolute worst time?
Yeah, what was the thinking?
Well, the research suggests Kammern-Grubgraben, despite being incredibly cold, might have actually been sort of a refuge.
A refuge. Compared to what?
Compared to the even harsher conditions in the, surrounding landscape. Maybe higher elevations or more exposed areas.
Okay.
But what really makes this site stand out is just the sheer amount of stuff they found.
Right, you mentioned tools, ornaments.
Tools, ornaments, artifacts, yeah. And even extensive stone structures. The research paper really hammers this home. It's the largest concentration of these kinds of finds anywhere in Europe for this really intensely cold period.
That is quite something. So a lot of activity, a lot of people, presumably, in this frozen landscape.
Seems that way.
Okay, so a significant human presence. What were they relying on? The general article hinted their diet changed from earlier times.
That's a key point. If you look at slightly older sites nearby, from the Gravettian period.
Okay, Gravettian, that's the period just before this.
Yeah, a bit earlier, same region. Sites like Kremshongstig, Kremswalkberg.
Yeah.
But those places mostly show evidence of mammoth hunting, lots of mammoth remains.
Big game. Makes sense.
But then you get to Kammern-Grubgraben during the LGM, and the picture flips completely. The animal bones are overwhelmingly reindeer, Rangifer tarandus.
Wow. So from mammoth to almost just reindeer.
Pretty much. It's a really stark contrast.
And the journal article asks the big question then. Why? Why this super narrow focus? Was it just, that's all that was left? Ecological impoverishment.
Or was it a deliberate choice? Were they targeting reindeer for specific reasons, specific activity?
Right. How do we figure that out?
Well, they used stable isotope analysis on the animal bones.
Okay, isotopes. That tells you about diet, right, based on chemicals in the bones.
Exactly. You can see what the animals were eating. And what's fascinating is the analysis shows a real drop in the variety of diets for herbivores leading up to the LGM.
Things were getting tougher for them, too.
Yeah. And that unique isotopic signature you see for mammoths at the older sites, it's gone. Completely disappears at Kammern-Grubgraben.
No mammoths, or at least very few.
Seems like it. And even other animals like horses and hares. Before the LGM, they had pretty distinct diets. But at Kammern-Grubgraben, their isotope signatures look much more similar.
So fewer types of big animals, and the ones left were eating more similar things. The ecosystem was simplifying.
That's what it looks like. The isotope data at Kammern-Grubgraben suggests maybe a bit of a split, reindeer and ibex, possibly in drier areas.
Okay.
And maybe mammoth, horse, hare, and wetter valley-type spots.
Yeah.
But overall, much less diversity than before.
And did they check if it was just consistently cold?
They did. They looked at oxygen isotopes in horse teeth from Kammern-Grubgraben and the older Kremswalkberg site. Both show consistently cold conditions.
Reinforcing the LGM picture.
Definitely. Which brings us back to the question. If resources were dwindling and it was so cold, why the intense focus here? Why so many reindeer?
There must have been something really valuable about those reindeer beyond just meat.
Exactly. And that article title, Ice Age Apparel, it points right at it.
Fur, clothing.
It seems very likely. While reindeer were obviously food and material for tools, the researchers argue pretty strongly that this intense focus suggests getting high-quality reindeer fur for clothing was critical.
Makes total sense. You can't survive minus 3.5 average without some serious insulation.
And they specifically mention winter reindeer fur being particularly good,
Yeah.
really valuable.
I remember the general article quoted someone, Ian Gilligan, I think, saying this supports the idea that prehistoric tech wasn't always just about food.
Right, and connecting to that,
Yeah.
they found a lot of eyed needles at Kammern-Grubgraben.
Eyed needles. Okay, that's significant. Why?
Because eyed needles are what you need to make tailored clothing. Tight, regular seams.
For well-fitting, properly sewn garments, not just graping skins.
Exactly. You can't survive those temperatures with leaky seams. The sheer number of needles suggests making and repairing high-quality fur clothing was a major activity there.
So it wasn't just opportunistic hunting. It sounds like a planned operation almost. How did they figure out the details? Like which reindeer they were hunting, age, sex, time of year?
They did a whole range of analyses on the reindeer bones, teeth, and antlers.
Oh,
They tried looking at dental cementum. That's like tree rings on teeth can sometimes tell you the season of death.
did it work?
Not great. Preservation wasn't ideal, so limited success there. But they had better luck studying how the teeth developed and looking at wear patterns.
Tooth wear. Like aging a horse by its teeth, but for a reindeer.
Kind of, yeah. Though the paper mentions it's tricky. There's natural variation, Wear differs between animals, even between teeth in the same mouth.
Right. Not perfectly precise.
No. But by looking at lots of teeth, they could see patterns. They calculated the minimum number of individuals, the MNI.
How many reindeer minimum were represented by the bones?
Exactly. And in the main layer, KGAH2, they found teeth from at least 191 reindeer.
191. That's a lot of reindeer.
It is. And they could even break it down roughly 53 calves, 35 yearlings, 103 adults, just based on teeth.
Wow.
They also looked at bone fusion in the skeletons, which gave a slightly lower number, around 60, but still confirms a very large number were processed there. Bottom line, super intensive focus on reindeer.
Okay. And males versus females, did they target one or the other?
That was harder to tell. The bones were
Got it.
really fragmented.
Makes sense.
And comparing sizes to modern reindeer is tough because populations differ. But looking at the few pelvic bones they could identify from adults, it was roughly a 1-to-1 sex ratio. Maybe slightly more males, but very few samples.
So about even based on pelvises.
But then when they looked at the size of other bones, it kind of hinted that maybe adult females were more common overall.
Conflicting signals.
A little bit. It just shows you the challenges of archaeology. Different lines of evidence sometimes give slightly different pictures.
Okay, so tons of reindeer, all ages, maybe slightly more females overall. But the key thing for the clothing idea, were they hunting them in winter when the fur is best?
Right. And this is where antlers and teeth really helped. They found some skulls with antlers still attached.
Okay, what does that tell us?
Based on when reindeer naturally shed antlers, it suggests hunting happened sometime between late autumn, early winter, and maybe the end of May.
So definitely covering the coldest months.
Yes. And remember that dental cementum analysis? The one tooth that worked? It indicated a winter death.
Okay, one data point, but it fits. Anything else on timing?
Yeah, the tooth wear analysis on the young reindeer was more robust. By looking closely at the wear stages on specific teeth.
The PD4 and molars.
Right. They found a lack of wear stages that would correspond to the summer months.
Meaning
Meaning the young reindeer remains found at the site likely didn't die during the summer. They were probably hunted in the colder months.
Interesting. So the sample is biased towards winter kills.
It appears so. They also found a fetal reindeer bone. Tiny thing.
A fetus, wow.
Yeah. And based on its size compared to modern caribou fetuses, they estimate it died sometime between midwinter and early late winter.
More evidence for winter activity.
And it wasn't just reindeer. They looked at horse teeth, too. Milk teeth from young horses suggested they died in their second winter, maybe November to February.
Okay.
And an ibex jaw from a young animal also pointed to a winter death.
So multiple species, multiple lines of evidence, all pointing towards winter hunting.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The conclusion is pretty strong. Reindeer, ibex, horses at Kammern-Grubgraben were likely hunted primarily, maybe even exclusively, in winter.
And this fits a bigger pattern, right? The paper mentioned a shift in the region.
It does. Looking regionally, the earlier Gravescian sites seem to show human presence more spread out through the year, maybe even more in warmer months.
Okay.
But the later sites, like Kammern-Grubgraben and another called Langenloy A, show this much stronger signal for winter occupation.
So over time, people in this area specialized more in handling the winter.
It looks like a trend towards developing specific adaptations for surviving, maybe even focusing on the harshest season.
Okay, so winter hunting, lots of reindeer. But if it was just about food, like maximizing calories or fat, wouldn't they target specific animals, like prime adults? Why hunt calves and yearlings too?
That's exactly the researchers' point. The mix of ages they found, the calves, yearlings, adults, it actually looks a lot like a natural wild reindeer herd structure in winter.
Huh. They were taking a cross-section of the herd.
Seems like it. And the sex ratio, too, potentially more adult females. That also matches natural winter herds, because males often have higher mortality rates.
Interesting. So they weren't obviously selecting for, say, the biggest males or the fattest females.
The lack of obvious selection against any age group or sex suggests maximizing meat or fat wasn't the only goal, or maybe not even the primary one. Which is interesting because adult females are usually fattest in winter.
So if not just food, not just maximizing meat, it circles back again.
To the fur, yeah.
The paper really talks up how good reindeer fur is.
It's incredible stuff. Reindeer are just exceptionally adapted to the cold. Their fur is super dense. The hairs are hollow.
Willow hairs, like tiny straws.
Exactly. Traps air for amazing insulation, down to minus 50 C apparently. Plus, they have a woolly undercoat and these longer guard hairs for protection.
Wow. Nature's Gore-Tex.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And if you look at ethnographic studies, how modern Arctic peoples use reindeer.
Right. The general article mentioned researchers looking at indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, and that knowledge is crucial. These studies show reindeer skins are vital for everything in Arctic survival. Clothing, yes, but also tents, bedding, boots.
The full survival kit.
Absolutely. And the quality changes seasonally. Winter pelts are warmest. Calf or young animal pelts are softer, maybe better for certain items.
But you mentioned it's not very durable.
That's another key point. Reindeer fur, for all its warmth, wears out relatively quickly. So you'd need a constant supply. You'd have to keep hunting them regularly to replenish your clothing and gear.
Driving that need for lots of reindeer winter after winter.
Exactly. And connect that back to the eyed needles. That technology allows you to make the most of that fur. Create those tailored, warm garments, essential for living on permafrost.
It really paints a picture of specialized adaptation.
It does. And the paper suggests this might be a key difference. Maybe human groups living on the permafrost, like at Kammern-Grubgraben, developed this intense reindeer fur focus.
Compared to groups maybe further west off the permafrost?
Yeah. Right. Maybe groups in slightly less extreme areas had broader strategies.
Yeah.
It's like complementary adaptations to different environmental pressures.
But they weren't wasting the rest of the animal, right?
Oh, definitely not. The bones are highly fragmented, which shows they were processing them intensively for meat, for marrow fat, for making bone tools.
Using every part.
Totally. And those big stone structures, the interpretation is they might have been meat caches, places to store surplus food.
Which also suggests they were getting more than they could eat immediately, fitting that large-scale hunting picture.
Exactly. It all ties together.
Okay, so let's recap. Kammern-Grubgraben paints this really vivid picture. Ice Age humans, last glacial maximum, adapting to brutal cold.
Right. And they did it by apparently specializing in hunting reindeer, mostly or entirely in the winter.
And the key driver, maybe the primary driver, wasn't just food. It was getting that incredibly warm, essential reindeer fur for clothing.
That really seems to be the central argument, supported by multiple lines of evidence. The sheer number of reindeer, the mix of ages and sexes matching winter herds, the winter hunting evidence, the needles. It points strongly towards fur being critical.
It's kind of mind-blowing that survival hinged so much on, well, tailoring, on having the right coat.
It really underscores how crucial technology, even seemingly simple tech like a needle, and deep ecological knowledge were for our ancestors.
So thinking beyond this site, what's the big takeaway for us?
I think this deep dive really highlights that incredible human ingenuity and adaptability. Consider how something like the eyed needle, combined with really understanding reindeer and their seasons, let people thrive in what seems like an impossible environment.
Yeah.
It makes you think, what are the sort of invisible adaptations, the maybe overlooked technologies or knowledge systems that are critical for societies today, especially as we face our own environmental changes? What seemingly basic things might turn out to be absolutely vital for our future.
That's a really provocative thought to end on. What are our reindeer coats and eyed needles going to be?
Something to ponder.
Definitely. Well, thanks for digging into this with me. And if you, the listener, have sources you think deserve the deep dive treatment, let us know. Keep exploring, keep questioning. Thanks for joining us.